Sorry. I don't know what's happening there. Okay, welcome back everybody. So we're back here to pick up on our series of lectures on methods as part of the Studying Human Performance module. So hopefully you all enjoyed Enrichment Week last week and found it a nice break from regular lectures. I think even as staff we enjoyed the opportunity as well to catch up on some other things as well relating to teaching. And I'm sure you all found it useful as well to just take a bit of time, hopefully, to just make sure that you've caught up as much as possible with all the different parts of the module. Obviously on this particular module you've got the different elements, you've got the methods content that I'm teaching you, the statistics content that Rob teaches you, plus the statistics that Sue teaches you with SPSS. So hopefully you're able to keep a track of where you are with that. So we're moving on to the topic of questionnaires today. Now hopefully quite a lot of you will have looked at this. I can see on Moodle that quite a few people have already started to look at some of the content on questionnaires. There's quite a few that haven't. That's okay. You've still got a few more weeks until your coursework is due. Remember, your first assignment that you need to do for this module is creating your own questionnaire. So there's no panic at this stage. You've still got plenty of time to do this. You've still got time to go through all of the teaching material that's on Moodle, as well as the content that we'll do today. We've also got a seminar in 2 weeks' time, or a tutorial, which I'm devoting entirely to questionnaires as well. That's mainly to answer any questions that you have in relation to your own coursework. There's about a week or so still left at that point to complete what you're doing. So I'm hoping everyone will be quite advanced in terms of what they're doing in planning their questionnaires at that point. So today we'll look at starting an introduction to self-report methods. And by that I mean in all kinds of methods where an individual, a person, might provide their own reports about their experiences or things that they've been doing, things they're feeling. And that's actually quite critical to think about it that way. Now sometimes people criticise things like self-reporting or questionnaires or interviews, and they may say, well, it's subjective and it's not as powerful or as useful as something that's objective. But I want you to have a think about that, because are things really as objective as we think they are? And is subjectivity a problem anyway? If I want to ask you how you're feeling about this module, the best thing to do is to ask you. So that kind of subjective report has to be a good thing. And even something that we might consider to be objective, so observation, we might consider to be something we can see with our own eyes. We might feel that it's objective, but we still have to interpret that. We still have to probably describe it. We have to somehow record what's happening. We somehow have to explain it to other people. So even in some things that we feel that there's objectivity, there's still subjectivity. So don't look and place too much emphasis on critiques around subjectivity. It's important to be aware of it, and to be aware of some of the limitations associated with it, but it's also important to be aware of the benefits and the power of subjectivity and the value of it as well. So when we're talking about self-report methods, we're largely thinking about things like questionnaires, interviews, but there's other methods as well. Like I could ask you, some of you may do this already, you may keep a diary, and that diary might just record your thoughts or feelings on a particular day. We can use these in research settings as well. We've used these in transport studies where people may keep a diary on journeys they take. So it's their own subjective perceptions, their experiences, the things that they've encountered during a particular journey. So that could be a form of self-report method as well. But we'll talk a little bit more about some of the features of that before going on to really start thinking about one particular method, which is questionnaires. Next week we'll move on to interviews, which is another method of self-report. So as I've done on some of the other sessions, I've tried to summarise just on a single slide some of the content that you'll find on Moodle. I don't intend to repeat all of this. If you've already looked at some of this content, some of this will be familiar with you and you recognise some of the content. If you haven't yet, then look out for it. You may find it. You may find that you're attracted to some of the particular aspects of it, and some of it is very relevant to what you'll be doing in planning your first assignments. So there's some content around just general theory of self-reporting, and something that I just want to briefly point out here is that if you just put your hands up, is anyone on the cognitive ergonomics module at the moment? So there's a few people have done that. You might have looked at something like this. You won't see the detail so much here, but it's I can zoom in so you can see some of the detail, but it's a model of human information processing. And just to very briefly explain this, if we experience some kind of stimuli, it could be something that we could see, it could be a light, it could be a noise, a sound, it could be touch. But sometimes we experience these things even before we actually perceive them. We may not even know that we've actually responded to something. There may be a flickering light somewhere that we've responded to. We don't consciously even perceive it, but we still respond to it anyway. It's just the way the human reacts as we wander around the world, as we're driving our cars. There's lots of things happening around us and we can't consciously perceive everything and remember everything, but we're still reacting to it. If we perceive things, some of the things, we may decide to make decisions in relation to some of the things. We see a light, we see a sign, we see a signal, we might consciously make a decision. Sometimes we might recall small amounts, we might be able to hold certain amounts of information in our working memory, or short-term memory it's sometimes called. So somebody gives us a telephone number or tells us a few facts, we can remember some of those things but not too many things. And some things we have in our long-term memory, so to interpret a situation we sometimes have to think back to things that have happened to us before, think back to our experiences of things that have happened. And in answering a question, we might have to bring some of that information into our working memory or short-term memory to be able to decide whether we want to answer that question or how we want to answer that question. And then we may actually answer. So as you can see, the things I'm trying to explain to you here are some of the steps we might need to be considering. We can apply this model if I was to ask you a question. There's a stimuli, there's a question that comes, something you can hear, or if it's in a questionnaire, it might be something you're reading off a page. We're perceiving it, we're trying to understand it, we're deciding what we want to respond, how we want to respond, We can hold some information in our memory at the time someone asks us something. If you ask me a very long, complicated question, I might not be able to hold all of that in my mind at once. If you ask me 2 or 3 questions at once, I might be able to remember the first one or the last one, but not all of them. I might have to actually think back and try and think of some experiences. If you ask me, how was today in comparison with yesterday, I've got to start thinking about what was yesterday like. So there's lots of things that are happening when you ask somebody a question, and then you've got to decide how you want to answer it. If it's one of your friends, you might answer it in quite an informal way. If it's one of your lecturers who's asking you a very formal question, you might decide you want to answer it in a very formal way. And the same things happen when we're thinking about questions as well in questionnaires. So we've got to think about how someone's actually understanding something or perceiving a particular type of question. So it's a little bit of background. There's more content on Moodle about this, but I think it's important for you to understand this. We'll talk more about this next week when we talk about interviews as well. And you'll see some of this is reflected in some of the other content as well, which we will see when we're talking about questionnaires. And particularly when we come on to talk about the paper by Norbert Schwartz, which is online on Moodle. So when I ask questions, there's all sorts of different questions. I could ask you, what is your name? And it seems like a very simple question, but even thinking back to what I've just said, there's many different ways we could answer that question. You know, if you were to ask me that question, I could say, well, my name's Brendan, my name's Dr. Ryan, my name's Brendan Ryan. You know, there's many answers, and I would give different answers in different contexts. So you can see that also I have a decision to make at the point that I'm answering that as well. How do I phrase this? How do I present this? So the way it's presented in a questionnaire can be important as well. We get these different types of questions and different types of response categories. Sometimes we have options that we're expecting people to choose from. We might give people categories of answers. I'm sure you've seen loads of questionnaires over your time. You get asked to fill them in all of the time, and you'll recognise some of these. Sometimes we're asked to provide a rating on something. Sometimes they're based on scales or validated scales, such as the system usability scale, which maybe you might start to come across, particularly the human computer interaction students. You might be more familiar with that than some of the others. Well, there's many kinds of validated scales. The standardized Nordic questionnaire is another validated scale. So some people have already created some of these kinds of questions. So remember, different types of questions and different types of response types. And there's some judgments you have to make in choosing between them. Should I ask an open question? Should I ask a question where I give people some options to choose from? If anyone's read the Schwartz paper, you might realise that the type of questions you use and the type of response scales that you use can influence the kind of answers that you get as well. So if there's one paper I would recommend reading, it's a paper by Schwartz. That's if you're only going to read one, definitely read that one. I think you should be reading more. There's more online, but definitely the Schwartz one. Schwartz talks about lots of the content which I've already started to try to consider. So how we comprehend a question. The title of the Schwartz paper is actually how self-reports how the questions shape the answers. So the way we phrase a particular question may influence how someone is going to answer it. But it's not just the way they phrase it, it's also the alternatives we give people also influence that as well. And we'll see a little bit more of that as we work through the presentation today and the lecture today, so I won't say too much more about this at the moment. Schwartz also talks about thinking about the context in which you're asking particular questions. So again, think back to that situation. Something that's very informal or something that's very formal might change the way somebody might respond to a particular question. I sometimes we ask people to do things that maybe it's difficult or even impossible for them to do. Or they would do it. If I ask someone, tell me how many times you brushed your teeth in the last year, nobody's got a record of that, have you? Nobody, I don't think so. I don't think you write down how many times you do it. But you could all estimate or compute an example of how many times you've done this. So, for example, a lot of people brush their teeth in the morning and in the evening. And then you can calculate, well, how many days are there in the week or the year? And you can come up with an estimate. And you could say, yes, I've done it that many times. That might be sufficient for us to know something like that. But you can think of many variations of similar things like that, where if we're asked to give a frequency, we're often estimating or even guessing. And because someone asks us a question, we assume someone's asked me that question, I should know the answer to that question. Therefore, I'm going to estimate something and give that answer. And I might answer it very confidently, but it might not be a very accurate answer, even though I give a very confident answer. Again, we'll talk more about this next week. One of the studies that I did in the past was about train driving, and it was about the kind of reports that train drivers give after an incident has occurred. And the paper that's on Moodle, you'll see it next week. The train drivers were asked by many people to explain an incident that occurred. They might have been asked by their manager, they might have been asked by maybe the enforcing authorities that come along to investigate it. They might be asked by a supervisor, they might be asked by their colleagues. They're asked in multiple times. Sometimes they're interviewed and they were asked questions, things like, well, what speed were you going? What speed were you going at this particular point? Now, they may or may not have been aware of the speed they were going. But because they've been asked that, they often will give an answer. Well, I know I should have been going at 50. I think I was going at about the speed limit. I was going at 50 or just under 50. So people will say things, but is that actually a good reflection on what they were actually thinking at the time? So again, think about how we ask questions, because if we force people to answer very specific questions, they'll give you an answer, but it may not actually reflect the real situation. That's not a problem with questionnaires. That's not a problem with subjectivity. That's just a problem with you haven't asked a very good question. There would have been better ways of asking that particular question. Think about interviews and questionnaires as there's a conversational aspect to it. If I'm talking to anyone, the conversation develops. If I've asked you something, we both know that question's been asked before. I don't need to recap and keep saying, I asked you about this before, think back to that. You know, we know that question's been asked. And it's the same in questionnaires. If I ask you about a particular topic, that topic's probably uppermost in your mind as I'm asking you another question. So sometimes, and Schwartz talks very much about this, how earlier questions can influence the responses to another question. So I like sports, I like football. If I talk a lot about football and then I start asking people about what are your favourite pastimes, it wouldn't be surprising if a lot of you started to think about sporting examples, because I've been talking about football. You might hate football, but you might think of other sports because it's how you connect those things together. So again, it's the order of those questions can influence how people actually respond. So you need to bear these kind of things in mind. On Moodle, I've also given you a checklist of things to consider. I won't go into details on these, but as you're developing and planning and executing a questionnaire, these are some of the stages you need to consider. There's more content on Moodle. There's a few examples which I've included. Again, we'll come back and have a look at some of those in this session. And coming right back to here, don't be surprised if the answers you get from a subjective questionnaire can be different to something you collect objectively. But don't necessarily assume that the questionnaire is wrong. It could be that there's problems with what you perceive as the objective measure as well. There's lots of different reasons for that. Again, there's a bit more content on that. So they're just different, and it's okay to compare things. It's okay to try and triangulate and use different methods. That's often a good thing to do. Get people's subjective opinions of something, but also use another method to try to get more data relating to the concept that you're interested in, but value each of them for what they are. Again, we'll look at some of those in a little bit more detail as we look through the presentation. So that's an overview of content that's on Moodle. Do work through the content. It is very much an overview. But some of the things I'll talk about now are picking up on, for example, the reference I would refer to here is always Schwartz. It is also mentioned in Moroney and Cameron. They refer back to some of the earlier content as well. But we've got a couple of questions here. So this is related to the content that's on in Schwartz. But how often did you feel angry last month? And then we've got another version of that same question, but how often did you feel angry last month? And we've given people some options here. So, anyone got any preferences? Who would prefer the first one? Just put your hands up if you prefer the first one. Who would prefer the second one? So I think it's quite clear there. People prefer the second one. So why do you prefer the second one? Let's have some suggestions for why the second.
More clear.
Sorry.
More clear and easy to make the choice because you got the option.
You've got options, so it's easy. You find it easier to do that. I think it goes back to what I was saying earlier about if I ask you to recall the times, like the toothbrushing example, it's very, very difficult to recall those kind of times. Anything else? Any other comments on this? So most people preferred that, but yeah. Sorry, just a bit louder.
Last month, they're asking about the last month, so it is a huge duration. So it is better to have options as to what the person is expecting as an answer.
Yeah. So it is a duration, isn't it? It's quite a duration, isn't it, over the last month. We can all think back. It would be even harder if it was over a year. Some questions do ask something like that. Now, if someone asks that, even any of those kind of questions, how many times over that kind of period, it's definitely easier to do it over a shorter period of time. If I asked you how many times were you angry today, that might be easier to recall. Certainly over a week, that becomes harder. Over a month, it's even harder. What else do we have to think about in this particular question? Is it a good question? Where might we also experience problems?
It's a bit vague in the sense that some people feel anger at different levels, so
yeah.
I don't know what, maybe not every day.
Absolutely. So even the terminology, what do we mean by anger? So how often do we feel angry? So, is it a little bit of anger? Is that okay? So I think we all feel angry quite a lot, don't we, for lots of reasons. And so we might be feeling lots of anger, but we're not particularly angry people. We only have a little bit of anger rather than a huge amount of anger. What about these options? Has anyone got any comments on the options?
In the first question, you could be angry twice a day.
Yeah.
On the second question, it doesn't give you that option. It only says it assumes you're angry either all day or
Yeah.
not all.
Yeah, good point. So yeah, you could say twice a day for the first one, and that seems quite low as a number. And actually, that's the highest category we can have in that other one, every work day. And that almost puts us into, that's that highest category, isn't it? Were you going to say something different?
I was supposed to ask why haven't you covered every day? Because every work, why not weekends? For instance.
So it could be, if this was about work, then it might cover work day. So, that might be relevant. But yeah, you might have to think about framing it for different time periods. So I think one thing we have to think about, whenever you put categories on there, categories can be good. Most of you like the idea of having categories. Most of you prefer to have categories, but make sure you get those categories right. Because what are you trying to do when you set categories? you are trying to discriminate your population or your sample, and you're trying to break them down and say something different about them. If everybody ends up in every work day, then you're not really finding out anything as a result of this questionnaire. All you're doing is you're putting everyone in that category. Yeah?
You mentioned that we're trying to discriminate our subjects or do a questionnaire in categories such as this. So if we were to pick different frequencies and categories, and when we come to analyze our results, would we then just, not consider certain groups or certain people in that sample, that appear in different frequencies? So for example, if we only want to consider people that are higher frequencies, such as 2 to 4 days per week or every work day, would we then just not consider the results of the people in the other categories?
Well, I think the point here is that most people, I think, would be in that very high category, because I think for a question like this, it could be that most of your population is going to fall in that. And if you're having 5 categories, those categories, you should expect that they're going to cover your population and should, I'm not saying equally distribute them, but at least have some distribution across them. So you've got to try to work out, if you're having categories, what should those frequencies be? Are they appropriate categories for the question that you're asking? And so this just isn't a great question, because it just doesn't really help us. And there's also things that people do. They think, well, I don't think I'm an angry person. I'm not putting myself in that top category. I'm going to put myself in the middle because I think I'm kind of middling angry. And that might mean, it might be meaningless, because you've just set your categories wrong. And you've got to think, how are people going to interpret your questionnaire? And how are they going to answer it? And they may have these, their own ideas. They're almost trying to second guess what you're trying to do. So you've got to try and make it as simple as possible. We'll have a look at another question, and we'll see here, because again, we're talking about, I think it's a similar point that we have here. How many hours did you watch television yesterday? And then how many hours did you watch television yesterday? And I think we can see similar kinds of things that might happen here. Now, as I've used this question over a number of years, and I realise that a lot of people don't even watch television now, do you? You're watching other kinds of things. It used to be very common people would watch television, so it might be very low, but it's actually quite easy to actually think back to yesterday and to think, well, what did I watch? And you think, well, maybe I watched a film. How long was that film? It was about 2 hours. And that automatically starts putting me again in one of the top categories. So even if I wasn't a big television watcher, even watching one film might put you in that category. So again, you've got to think, have I got that distribution right? If I'm putting categories in there, make sure it's going to cover what's reasonably expected from your population. Now, what you might have to do in those circumstances is do some pilot studies. I don't expect you to do this for your questionnaires. You might have examples of this from other questionnaires that other people have done, the kind of frequency estimates that people might have, or just explain to me why you're sorry about this. It's for some reason every time this bit touches, I don't know why it is. It's not even the microphone. It's the bit here. Every time it touches something, it makes a noise. I'll try not to touch anything. So sorry about that. So just try to make sure that your frequency categories are appropriate and seem plausible, and just try to explain why you've chosen them. And again, this one is unlikely to discriminate much because they're too small, really, the categories that we've got. Now, this is another example which has come from Schwartz. And here we've got 2 questions, and this is where it's talking about the sequencing of the questions. You can read more about this in the paper on Schwartz, but it talks about in surveys, and they've got the results from this where it's been applied in other studies, is where you ask, how satisfied are you with your life, and how satisfied are you with your marriage? And then in another case, it was asked, how satisfied are you with marriage, and how satisfied are you with your life? So all it is, it's the same questions, they're just answered in a different order. There's another variation which they do ask, and it was you will be asked 2 questions related to well-being, one about marriage and one about life as a whole. So there's 3 different answers that they got. Now you can look ahead and you can look in and read more about this in the Schwartz paper, but to just spoil the result for you and to just explain it a little bit here in the class, that what they found is that the results for these were correlated when they asked this to a sample of people. But what was interesting was that the correlation was higher between these questions when the order was reversed in this particular way. So when you asked first, how satisfied are you with your marriage, and then how satisfied are you with your life, there was a greater correlation between those questions and the answers in those questions. Now the interpretation that was given is that in this case the order seems to bring marital related information to mind as people are making judgments on how satisfied are you with life in general. It was less so when you ask the question first, how satisfied are you with life, and then asking how satisfied are you with your marriage. So the 2 were more separated in that particular case. Now the other variation of that was where they asked the 2 questions, but they had this preliminary statement in first. You will be asked 2 questions related to well-being, one about marriage and one about life as a whole. Now what this seemed to do here, now we've got lower correlation between the answers that we got, and what the researchers interpreted from this was that the people who answered the questions interpreted this as, aside from marriage that you've already told us about, how satisfied are you with life in general? So people separate those things out and they're portioning them out. Now the main point, I know that's quite complicated to get your heads around, and do read the content that's in the Schwartz paper, but the main point about this is, do think about where you've got a question, could the answer to that question influence what's actually being reported later on? And do try to think about and give some attention to how you might order those particular questions. The answers are not always easy, or the solutions to how you would do this, but do bear that in mind. That's one of the key things to think about. Another point that's mentioned in Schwartz is this idea of having free text answers or giving people options. So Schwartz talks about some earlier work that was done by these people, and there's a question that was asked, what is the most important thing for children to prepare them for life? So when you gave people a list of options, and within that list of options, the option was there to think for themselves, almost 2/3 of people pick that from the list as one of the most important things to prepare people for life. But where you ask it only as a free text question, so you just ask someone what's the most important thing to prepare people for life, very few people, less than 5% of people, actually thought that that was the most important thing. So again, think about where do you want your free text questions, where do you want to give people certain options. And if you're going to choose options, make sure they are suitable options. And again, it comes back to that whole point of the Schwartz paper. Remember the title of that paper, Self-Reports, How the Questions Shape the Answers. We can see here that by having questions and certain response categories can influence how people are actually reporting. So again, plenty to bear in mind as you're thinking about your questions. Another point, now this was content which I picked up when I was doing my PhD study quite a few years ago now. This was relatively contemporary around the time. I started my PhD in '95, and it was literature I came across at the time. And we've got a question here, do you bend or use twisted postures several times per hour? Or do you use repetitive hand or finger movements several times per minute, exceeding 2 hours per day? When you think about that, they're complicated questions. These are from published literature. And again, people have to then rate that, go back to that model of human information processing that I referred to earlier on, where you've got to understand what someone's asking you. You have to understand what the purpose of that question is. Think back, try and hold it in your short-term memory what the question's about. Think back to your experiences and then almost compute an answer. And this starts to become difficult. And you've got to start putting it into these categories. Another example of this, how much of the time is your trunk bent forward 20 to 40 degrees? So again, trying to think of time estimates. Do people even perceive bending of the trunk in certain angles? Are they able to do that? How much of your time is your trunk rotated 45 degrees? Again, are people aware of this? And then having to compute these estimates of about a quarter of the time, half the time, a third of the time. So things like this are very difficult questions to answer. So then it's not surprising when some of the literature that I was reading around this time, they were criticising self-report methods and saying the answers to this just don't compare with the objective data, where we observe people and we see how much of time they're bending their back 20 to 60 degrees, and their estimates are nowhere near what we can objectively observe. And so self-report methods are just no good. Now, I would say that is not a valid conclusion. It's not that self-report methods are not good, it's that the question you're using is not good. Don't ask people those questions. Ask people better questions. So my research at the time was trying to understand what are people aware of. Are they even aware of bending their back? And people generally weren't in those kind of circumstances. So I came to the conclusion that a lot of these questions were not very good questions. Now I said we've got a few examples, and some of these are on Moodle as well, and you can see more content on a few examples. There's a bakery example and there's this example, but we did a project recently where the rail industry, I won't tell you the whole story about this, it'll take a while to tell it, but they started to put blue lights in railway stations to try to improve the behaviour of people in particular stations and try to have safer behaviours of people in railway stations. There's a lot of scepticism about how blue light actually work, but we were asked to try and evaluate what is the impact of this lighting. So we came up with a questionnaire to try to talk to people or try to ask people about their perceptions of the lighting at the station. Now question number 8 was like this, but we've got all of these other questions first. So how often do you visit the station? How long do you usually wait? How would you describe your mood? How was your day so far? Is there anything you like about the appearance of the platforms? Is there anything about the appearance that you particularly dislike? And then what do you think of the lighting? So what do you think our motivation was? Why did we do it this way? Should we have just gone straight in and said, what do you think of the lighting?
How people should refresh.
Sorry?
How people should refresh their memory. They use the question to refresh the people's memory that he can go through what he's doing in his all day and then ask her about the life. Maybe they will remember this.
Possibly. I think again, think very much in terms of the order of the questions here. You know, we've got this afterwards, and perhaps we could say, well, could some of these other questions influence how they would answer that last one? But we were interested in the lighting. We wanted to know, what do you think of the lighting? You know, we did. That was our goal. But we were also wanting to know things like, could the lighting have an impact on people's mood, for example? But if we go straight in for the question on what do you think of the lighting, then people will then start to relate every question that we've got just in the construct almost of thinking about the lighting and just relate it back to the lighting. And what we were trying to find out more, and you can see the way, almost the progression through this, we wanted to know, well, how familiar are people with the station? You know, do they come to the station very frequently? Are they familiar with the station in the sense that do they wait for a long time? We wanted to get an idea about how they were feeling at that particular time. Is there anything about, again, we didn't want to go straight for the lighting, because what we also didn't want to assume is that people had even seen the lighting. So we wanted to know, how does this lighting work? How does it influence people? If I go straight to the lighting and say, how is this lighting influencing your behaviour? You can construct all kinds of stories about how that lighting might be influencing your behaviour. What we wanted to know, well, what did people think of the station? Now at that point they could say, well, I don't like the lighting, or why have we got blue lighting? And that would at least tell me at this point, unprompted, that they've noticed the lighting and that there's something that has drawn their attention to the lighting. So we're gradually leading them towards that particular point. Is there anything about the appearance that you particularly like? So again, we're driving them more and more towards the visual appeal of the station, but again, not focusing initially on the lighting. And it's only towards the end of that we actually decided, because they might not, if we just left it at those kind of questions, and this, you know, to think through the logic of this, go back to that Swartz paper about the open questions and the categories. You know, we're trying not to influence people and to say, you know, how are you responding to the lighting? How is it affecting your behaviour? How is it affecting your mood? You know, we want to try and find out all the other things about how they're perceiving it in the context of the railway station. But they may not tell us anything with all these other questions, so we have our final question then that covers the lighting. Now we were of the opinion that if we asked that right at the start, what do you think of the lighting, it would then have an influence on how they think about the appearance of the light of the station. You know, what do they think about the appearance of the station? Because they would automatically relate it back to, well, the lighting doesn't help, or the lighting means I can't do this, or the lighting makes me feel bad, or the lighting makes me feel good, whatever it is. And then we had a rating scale that had these end anchors, and we had certain characteristics of the lighting we were trying to explore, and again giving people opportunity to rate within these whether they liked it or they didn't, like or dislike, whether they felt it was warm or cold, whether it was pleasant or unpleasant, calming or agitating. But we collected all of that other information first before the influence of the lighting. So again, that was just how we thought through the logic of that particular question. When you're starting to think about rating scales, there's quite a bit in the literature about this. I wouldn't say you need to read all of this because there's a fair amount of content, but I'll just explain a few pieces. The AMET one, Subjective Rating Scale, Science or Art, it's an interesting publication, this. Ergonomics is a journal. It's a very common journal that we publish in. And this is a particular edition of the journal. It's from 2002, so it's a number of years ago. But it's some classical literature within this. And the whole journal, it's not too big. There's not too many pages in it, but all of the papers in there are all about subjective rating scales. Now, all journals don't do this, but what they did was that ANET produced what they call the target paper. So they produced this paper which was all about subjective rating scales, science or art, and they wrote their opinions about rating scales and how they can be used. But then they invited contributions from a number of other researchers at the time, and I think there's about 14 commentaries that people provide. They're very short, they're only a page or two. And then at the end, ANET came back and almost gave a response in relation to all of those, all about rating scales. So it's more than you need for the coursework. If you're really interested in rating scales and you go on to do other work in this area, then it's worth a read. But I don't think you need it for the coursework. There's too much to read for that. The paper by Photius, Photius does a lot of work on lighting. It's a classic case of, you've heard the phrase nominative determinism. It's interesting, isn't it, that a name like Photius, somebody goes in and most of their career is about studying lighting. But they talk about using category rating scales to evaluate the lit environment. That paper's not too long, and there's some interesting ideas that are in there. It might be worth you having a look at that. There's a paper here also about the current practice in measuring usability. So it's not just covering things like rating scales and questionnaires, it talks about other ways of doing it as well. Again, you might find some interesting content within that. We did a big piece of work at Nottingham on the rail ergonomics questionnaire. I'm not going to go through all of the details of it now because there's content on Moodle about it. But what my first job as a researcher here after I'd finished my PhD was to take the rail ergonomics questionnaire that had been developed, an earlier version of it, and try to shorten it because it had got to the stage that it was so big it took 45 minutes for people to fill it in. And it meant that response rates were not very good. My first job was to try and shorten it, so to review all the questions, to work with some people at Network Rail and a professor who was here at Nottingham, John Wilson, to try to shorten the questionnaire, do some statistical analysis, some principal components analysis, try and keep questions on all of the main topics, and then have a target for administering it in under 20 minutes. Now, we did achieve that, and we did a survey, which was actually a national survey, where we had 4,000 respondents from Network Rail that completed the survey. There's several papers. This is one of them about the development. Well, this is actually the one that's got the first results. But the first paper is all about the development of the survey, and you'll find that model in there that explains how it was developed. I will say now, this is an advanced version of what you'll be doing. We're not expecting you to do something like this for your questionnaire. Your questionnaire is 3 minutes long at the most. So it's much, much shorter what you're trying to do. This is really opening your eyes to what you can do as researchers and when you're actually applying these things in bigger situations. But our questionnaire covered all of these different topics. You won't cover all of these different topics in your questionnaire. All the papers are on Moodle. The examples of the questionnaires are on Moodle as well. You'll see the old version and you'll see the new version. The old version was not very well laid out. The introductions were too long. It was hard to relate the response categories to the answers. It just looked messy and untidy. We improved it. It was a lot easier to complete, and you can compare the two versions if you have a look at the content on Moodle. In terms of administering it, we knew we had approximately 5,000 people that we wanted to try to get, and I explain on Moodle as well the process that we took to administer it as well. So we got this many responses. It was 3,800 responses. It was over an 80% response rate, and you can see the numbers of locations that we got. And that earlier paper there explains how we summarised and presented some of the findings from that. And again, we can see the overview of some of those kind of findings that we've got there. But do have a look at the content on Moodle and just have a quick flick through the questionnaire itself. That was really the content that I wanted to cover today. Just to recap on what we've actually done. So we've gone through what's on Moodle, and a general introduction to this whole concept of asking people questions and getting their self-reports from them. There's different ways in which we prompt questions. Questionnaires are just one way of doing it. They tend to be written. You've got one shot at it with the questionnaire. If you're doing an interview, you might be able to rephrase your question. You might realise people are not understanding it correctly. With the questionnaire, you're sending out your interpretation of what you're wanting, and people have to understand the information you're requesting and be able to provide something that's relevant to you. and that's going to help you with your research. So you've got to make sure you get it right. So we've looked at different question types and sequencing. That's particularly influenced by that paper by Schwartz. So do read that paper by Schwartz. Like I say, if you read one thing, read that. Read the other content on Moodle as well, but I think Schwartz is really valuable. We looked at some examples. So do bear in mind this thing. Don't accept the critique that self-report methods are not useful. You may produce different results from the things you observe, but that's because you're measuring different things. Self-reports are very much measuring how people perceive things, how they feel, how they experience things, what they think of things. You can't necessarily observe those things, so they're measuring very different things. If it's something that's better to be observed, like a posture, then observe it. Collect your data by a different method. But don't try to compare it and say, well, self-report's no good for that. Self-report's good for telling you other things about manual handling tasks, but not necessarily about people's postures. We looked at one example of lighting there. There's another bakery example that's on Moodle as well. And then there's this request questionnaire which we developed. Remember, that's more advanced than the kind of things you're doing in your surveys. But it's worth having a read through to think about that process that we looked through. There's another paper which I've put on Moodle as well, which is by Barga Sevilla and some colleagues. It's about internet satisfaction, development and validation of a questionnaire to measure user satisfaction with the intranet. So again, a very similar HCI type example to that kind of idea of developing a questionnaire to measure satisfaction in that particular case. So do look at some of these papers and look at how people are actually constructing these kind of questionnaires. So next week we'll continue with this theme of self-report. We'll be talking about interviews. And as I say, the week after that we'll have a seminar which is purely about questionnaires again and any problems that you're having with your questionnaires. That's on the 16th of November. Has anyone got any questions on the things that we've covered today? I'm hoping I've set the scene for what's on Moodle, and do go in and have a look at some of that content. These sessions are there to try and clarify a few things and point you in the right direction of the content, but some of it you need to go away and do that reading as well. Okay, well, Rob should be with you in probably 5 minutes or so. If anyone does want a short break, I'm sure he'll be starting at 5 or very shortly after 5. So thank you very much for your time today. Move away from there, just so that
as ever, I don't know if we'll get anything, but I can monitor the teams. Okay. Also, if you could remind them that it's on Echo 360 via Moodle. Okay. Because Sue was just telling me that apparently a couple of people can't find the broadcast. They're probably looking in the wrong place. Okay. Echo 360 via. Yeah. Goes to the Moodle page and then it's recorded and live seminars.